In this video, we're going to talk about a dilemma that Revit forces you to face, and it usually comes up when you're shifting from the modeling stage into the phase of the project where you're generating some views and then, of course, printing some sheets. And at this stage where you've pretty confidently created your model and it's got all of the complexity that you want, and you're pretty confident that it's going to result in some really good drawings because, of course, that's kind of the whole benefit of BIM software like Revit, is that you can make a model and then it will automatically, or so you think, create some really nice looking drawings. So you shift away from looking at the model in 3D to looking at a view of the elevation, like this one, for example, and looks reasonably good. You clean it up, you set the proper scale, and then it's time to put it on a sheet, and you set that up and everything looks reasonably good. And so it's time to print. And at this point, no reason to have any sort of lack of confidence in what it's about to generate. And then you print your sheet. In this case, I'm just going to be using a PDF. And there again, reasonably good results, just kind of what we expected. Looks a little flat though. We don't have the differentiation in the foreground and the background that we may have been hoping for. But that's all right. We know that if we go back to Revit, there's an easy tool for that. And if we go to the sheet view, all we have to do, of course, is just turn on, back in the actual view itself, the shadows. So in this case, I would just turn on the shadows using this little button down here on the lower left, and no problem. We're going to have a nice display of shadows here, which kind of gives the viewer an indication of what might be in the foreground and what might be in the background. So we take this view and these properties and we set it up on a sheet. And once again, we're pretty confident it's going to generate a nice looking elevation. And when we go to print, we get this. So the shadows are nice. The shadows are doing what they're supposed to do, but something's happened to the line work. So we get the indication here of some kind of foreground and background elements, but we've lost all the essential detail that we need with the line work. So we got a bit of a problem and we have to kind of make a choice. And this is where the dilemma comes up. Are we going to be a little bit more loyal to the line work as we saw in this initial print? Or are we going to pursue the option here that takes advantage of the shadows? And that dilemma is the thing that you're going to face quite often when it comes to many different types of drawings in Revit, but particularly when it comes to the elevations. And it's important to point out here that you don't really come across this until it's time to print, because as we showed back in these previous views, when you're actually working away in the software in Revit, you don't tend to notice this problem. Revit tends to represent the line weights with all the sort of emphasis that you would expect and hope for. And it's not until we generate something like a PDF, or maybe we actually print it, that we see this problem with these really faint lines. And what's happened here, the essential point here to be aware of, is that whenever you turn on the shadows or you shift away from hidden line into shaded or one of the other visual styles, what's going to happen is Revit is going to rasterize your view. So what that means, as you can see here in this little part of the canopy, is that it's pixelated the lines. So that's why we lost the nice detailed line work. It's turned them into pixels, which might not be so apparent on some of the horizontal or vertical elements, but as you can see on some of these kind of diagonal curved elements, it starts to look pretty noisy and we lose a lot of the essential detail. So what I'm going to do in the next few steps here is talk about how we can sort of develop each one of those strategies. The first set of demos is going to be about how we can enhance the line work and stick with what's called vector output. So in this case, you can see that because I stuck with hidden line and I didn't add any shadows, Revit generated some nice crisp looking black lines consistent with what we typically see with a drafted document. Now, it's true that if we zoom in here really close, we'll see that maybe they aren't quite as curved as we had hoped for, but it's at least nice and crisp, and we don't get that kind of faded out gray, anti-aliased kind of pixelated look. That's what we're trying to avoid. So as I said, we're going to develop both strategies. We're going to kind of refine this one so that it maybe picks up some of the advantages of the shadows, and then we're going to develop this one so that we preserve the shadows, but maybe put a little bit of extra emphasis on the line work. So to start this off, we're going to go back to our initial view here in the vector output, and I'll just make sure that we go back to what we originally saw in the PDF. So nothing inaccurate about this. Revit's done a good job, of course, of conveying all the detail that we built into the model and turning it into an elevation view. But as is the case with Revit, it doesn't get you all the way there. There's still some craft that's required, some drafting. And the first step, I guess, here would be to just pay attention to the line weights and maybe try to add this emphasis that suggests that some elements are closer to the viewer than other elements. Now, your first initial response to this might be, well, isn't there just a way to control line weights that doesn't involve any sort of customization Can't we just use the object styles? And those are available, of course, on the Manage tab. Here on the left side, this is where we set our line weights for things like, for example, walls. And even if we didn't want to go with this sort of project-wide strategy, couldn't we do something where we just used, for example, the visibility graphic overrides and maybe just set up some custom conditions for the walls in this view? And you can do that, but the problem is, of course, is that anything I do at this level, if, for example, I change the line weight so that everything in this view that is a wall displays with a heavier line weight, the problem is, of course, it's going to treat these walls in the background the same as it treats these walls in the foreground. So making that kind of broad modification to the line weights for the walls isn't really going to do what we want here. Remember, the objective is going to be to try to create some sort of differentiation between what's in the foreground and what's in the background. So we're going to look at another tool that we can use here to kind of add that emphasis. And maybe before I get to that, I'll just kind of make this point about a tool that I'm not going to use, which may have come to mind when I started talking about this topic. You'll notice in this particular view, as I kind of pause there and let it refresh, you'll notice that these elements in the background are gray, so that certainly would help. The heavier, more emphasized black lines in the foreground will kind of advance towards the viewer, while these ones kind of recede away from the viewer. The problem is you can see here that I haven't really added a lot of emphasis by adding the depth queue. So if I was to click over here on graphic display where we turn on depth queuing, you'll see it's available with this little pull down here, and I can change the numbers here so that there's different degrees of gray and there's a different point at which it switches from black to gray. But regardless of what I do here, I'm not really going to get the degree of emphasis that I want. And not only that, but as you'll see from this particular view, this printed sheet here, in this particular sheet, I kept the lines black. I didn't add any shadows, but you can see that because I turned on the depth queuing, I actually get the rasterization or the pixelation. So I don't want that. I'm not going to pursue depth queuing as a really viable option for this. I'm going to go back to Revit and I'm going to start to play around with a different tool. And this one's called the Linework Tool. So what I have here now, again, it's the same consistent style. I'm using the hidden style. And in all of these views, I'm just using the detail level set to coarse, which is in anticipation of creating the typical sort of look that we want with drafted views. And what I'm going to do now, instead of playing around with the object styles or the visibility graphic override settings, is I'm just going to add some extra emphasis to certain points or certain lines in the view using the Linework tool. And you can see that I've already started to do that. This particular element, once again, just to kind of remind you what we're going for here, this is the building. And it's this element here that's in the foreground I want to put some emphasis on. And so I start to do that with the Linework tool. And you can see here that it's added heavier weight to these walls while not doing the same thing to some of the walls that are in the background. So the way that this tool works is I just click on the Modify tab. And you'll see on the View panel that I have the Linework tool. And I simply activate that tool and choose a line style. And by default, you're going to see that there's most likely in most templates available in Revit, you're going to see that there is a wide line option available here. So if I click on that, I'll be able to, once again, just click on specific lines and add a little bit more emphasis to them. So this one, for example, if I click on it, you'll see that now it displays a little bit more heavily. If you want to make sure that you're seeing the line weights, of course, just make sure that your thin lines option is not turned on. Now, this can be a little bit of a difficult procedure. It's a little bit tedious. You have to be really careful about watching the blue highlight, just to kind of give you a prompt as to which line it's going to add more emphasis to. Because, of course, I'm dealing with a three-dimensional model, and there's going to be a lot of overlapping elements wherever I click. So I might have two different faces of a wall, and if I click, maybe I'll get one that I want and one that I don't. So just kind of pay attention to where the blue highlight is, and when you're confident that that's the line that you want to add a different line weight to, just go ahead and click. You also, once you've done that, have the ability to modify a little further with these little blue dot grips. So if for whatever reason this hadn't quite been in the right spot or maybe went too far, I can just grab that little blue dot grip and then pull it back so it goes to a point that I may have wanted. So I'm just going to do a few more clicks here. I won't do the whole procedure. I've already got one kind of finished in a later set, on a later sheet, but it's just going to kind of look like that. I wouldn't suggest trying to do a lot of different line weights. You might just need maybe 3 or 4 just to kind of add, again, some emphasis on foreground versus background. And you can also set up some custom line styles that maybe have a bit of a gray tone to them. so that they recede even further. If you want to have additional styles available to you in this list, remember all you have to do is click on the Manage tab and go to Additional Settings, and then just choose Line Styles. Expand the available set of line options, and then if you don't see what you like here, you can just click on New, and then you can enter a name, of course, and maybe we'll make one that's just called medium gray. And then you have the option here of specifying a line weight and then a line color. So I won't do that. As I said, I've already kind of got this finished, and we'll go to sort of the next phase here and talk about some other enhancements that we can make with this vector strategy. So having done a little bit of line work, now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a way that we can kind of simulate what happened with the shading option, with the rasterize option, but we're going to add a shadow in such a way that we don't have to rasterize the view. So I'll go next to this additional copy here of this elevation, and you'll see that initially I've got my shadows turned on. So I've just clicked down here on the shadows on button just to make sure that they're visible. And then what my strategy is going to be here is that I'm going to go to the Annotate tab, and I'm going to activate the Filled Region tool, and I'm actually just going to trace a shadow that matches what's been displayed by turning on the shadows option. So it might just be as simple as this. You'll get a little bit of lag, of course, because now as you sort of zoom in and zoom out, your machine's going to be attempting to refresh that rate more regularly. So try to keep that to a minimum, but I'm just going to rely on that shadow and just manually trace out where exactly it is that that shadow falls. There will be some elements when you do this that you can use the pick lines feature to specify, and then there's going to be times where you just kind of have to trace. So those lines there, I can do by just tracing, and now as I said, you can kind of use some existing geometry to finish off the sketch. And I'm just going to make sure, as in most cases in Revit with the sketch tool, that I've got a set of closed lines. And I'll just finish off the sketch by clicking on those two lines. And again, I get a bit of a lag because it's attempting to refresh the shadows. Once that's done, I can click on the green check. And initially what's going to happen is you're going to see that it's displayed really quite thick and black and quite opaque. That's a little bit too much emphasis. We don't want to see that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the shadows off so we can kind of see this isolated. And to reduce the opacity of this shadow, I'm just going to select it, right click on it, and choose Override Graphics in View by Element. And I'm going to add some transparency. So down here at the bottom where it says Surface Transparency, if I crank that up to something about 60%-ish, you'll see that now I get the impression of that shadow, but it because it's not opaque, it displays the line work behind. And if we go to the printed version of this, and I'll show you kind of a before and after. So this is the vector work here. So we've applied the Linework tool, so you can see that we've still got vectors. And what we've done in the next step here on sheet 6 is we still have vectors again, and we've added that single shadow. And you can see that the impression of just adding that one shadow is actually pretty significant. So if you're looking at this strategy and thinking, well, what would it be like to trace absolutely every little shadow on the face of this building? I don't think you need to do that. I'll show you on the next sheet here what it looks like when I've added a few more, but I didn't chase down every single shadow on every part of this building. That'd be ridiculously tedious and really not very efficient. But I don't think you have to do that. I think you can kind of get the impression by just doing a few major shadows. So there again is the completed view with just the one shadow. And now what I've done on this sort of final vector example is I've just added the line work. So again, if I zoom in, you can see that the foreground elements have received a little bit of emphasis. I've also, in this case, actually boosted the line weight of some of the other elements like the mullions. And I use the traditional method for this by just typing in visibility graphic overrides. So VG, you can see here that I've changed the line weight of elements like, for example, the mullions, as I said, and some of the sunshades as railing devices, railing items. So I've added some emphasis there, but more importantly, I've used the Linework tool to boost some foreground elements and differentiate them from background elements. And then I've added these manual shadows. And what's interesting about this manual shadow approach, and as I click on the elements that I did add, is that you can actually add a little bit of color to this. Not sure why you would need to do that, but the option does exist. It'll still allow you to apply some color or some different tone and maintain the vector quality of the lines, which is one of the rare cases in Revit where it will allow you to actually generate some vector color. So if we go to the final sort of printed sheet, you'll see that's the end result. So much better than the first example. We can see here now that we've got really good detail with the lines, so all the accuracy and complexity that we want with the line work has been maintained. But we've also been able to sort of take some of the advantages of the shadow tool and add a little bit of detail and a little bit of emphasis there as well. So we get something that reads a little bit more clearly. Certainly nothing wrong with having just a plain kind of flat line work sheet like this, but anything that we can do to help our viewer get a quicker read on our building so that they can kind of move on to focus on other elements of the project is definitely an advantage. And I think more likely to sort of prevent mistakes from being happened as people maybe misread the drawings. So that's our end result with the vector. We're going to jump over now and talk about some of the things that we can do with the raster tools. And it's really going to look initially exactly like what it looked like with the other tool. And by that, I just mean that we're going to use the line work. So you can see here as I jump now back to the raster version here where we've added the Revit shadows. If we add the line work tool, so same approach here, we've just kind of added a little bit more emphasis on foreground elements. We've turned shadows on. We have the cast shadows and the ambient shadows. So if I click over here on the graphic display button, you'll see that I've activated cast shadows and ambient shadows. I've made sure that my lines are smoothed with anti-aliasing. And I've also turned on, for this case here, I've turned on the depth queuing just so you can kind of see that in the background. It does add a little bit, but not really something that you would want to just kind of rely on all on its own. So there we can see now that we've got a little bit better sort of preservation of the line work. We've got some nice shadows. So it's really starting to look quite nice and a little bit more clear to those that might be just seeing this for the first time. The end result when we print is this. So again, much better than that first example that we saw where the shadows were turned on. We've got some good line weight here. It is rasterized. If I was to zoom in on a part of the building here that had maybe some diagonals or something curved, you'd see there are the pixels. So I haven't been able to overcome that, but that's all right. I've kind of restored some of the emphasis on the line work and maybe I can get by with a view that looks like this. I can actually even go a little bit further in Revit, just to kind of add a little bit of extra emphasis. And that might be to add some background. And then I've also got some background elements that'll be visible here. So I've added some trees in the background and specified that they have a gray tone to them. So they're going to kind of fade off into the distance a little bit more, kind of mimicking what happens with the atmosphere, of course, where we tend to see distant things with less contrast and a little bit more haze. And foreground elements have a little bit more contrast, and then they get that kind of extra emphasis with the black lines. So what I've done here again is I've added the background, and I'm going to go even one step further now with the next step, and I'm going to add some transparency. And this is kind of our end result here. Taking the rasterized elevation to kind of its furthest extent, as far at least as what's possible with the hidden line style and the detail level set to coarse. We're not getting into any rendering or any work in Illustrator or anything like that. But you can see there that by adding the full list of available options, I've got something that actually comes across quite nicely. Now, before I kind of show you the end result and some of the side-by-sides to start wrapping this up, I want to make the point here that this is not a default option. So you may have noticed that as you're working away in a 3D view, you see the transparency inherent in the windows and the glass surfaces. But when you go to an elevation view, that's not the case. So the way that you have to, what you have to do to kind of turn on this transparency option is you have to select all of the panels, in this case curtain wall panels, that you want to be transparent, and you have to use a special sort of an override that's specific to just those elements that you select. Now, once again, to describe the typical approach here, you might think that you would turn on your visibility graphic overrides and maybe just go to curtain panels, and you could override with a certain transparency for those ones. The problem with this is that you're going to get more than just the view panels if you use this approach. So if I was to select all the curtain panels and apply some sort of a, here it is here, if I was to apply a transparency to this, what would happen is I would get some curtain panels turning transparent that I didn't want transparent, like for example these spandrel panels in between the floors. So that's not the best approach for what we want to do here. A better approach would be to select a single instance of one of these panels. So if I hover over, let's say, one of these mullions, which represents the edge of the panel, and I use my tab key, of course, to select a panel like this. A really nice feature in Revit that's available for helping us make a really specialized selection like this is I can right-click and I can select all instances visible in view. It'll think a little bit, and then you'll see what it does here is it selects all of those panels, which of course on this project are meant to be transparent. And so now what I can do is I can right click and I can set up an override graphics in view by element. And that will allow me to set a transparency here for just those panels, while all the spandrel panels, which are meant to be kept opaque, are kept opaque. Something else that might help with this approach, once you've made a complex selection of a bunch of different panels, it's usually a good idea to just click up here on the selection panel and just click Save. And what this allows you to do is just save this selection set. It wasn't really hard to achieve this selection set in that case where I just kind of used the parameters of selecting all instances in the view. But if I had multiple selections and I had carefully spent several minutes selecting different items, I'd want to be able to quickly select all those items again. For example, I might want to change the 70% transparency to 40%. So I'd want to have a quick way to do that, and I could use this save selection to do that then. So I could just type in here view panels, and eventually this might include more than just those specific panels. I've already got it in the file, that's why it's telling me I can't do it, so I'll just exit out of this. It might include some door panels and maybe some handrails and a few other elements that weren't selectable with that initial method. So just remember to make use of these selection sets. When you want to retrieve them, they're available on the Manage tab over here on the right where it just says Load. So once you've saved it, you can click on Load, and then you'll see them available here in your filter list, and it'll make it easier to grab those panels all over again. So that was the final step, and I experimented with a few different levels and found a transparency that worked. And then the end result after setting up the views and printing was this image here. So just to kind of wrap this up, I'll show you some side-by-sides on each of our different sort of elevation experiments. And in the next view, you can see a sort of before and after on the vector approach. So there's our initial somewhat flat but very accurate and detailed line work strategy. And then we refined it with the Linework tool to add emphasis to foreground elements, and then we added some manual shadows. We preserved all the vector quality, and we've got this kind of brief, simple indication here of some shading. And then we moved into this is the side-by-side. So one last look here at the initial line work on the left, and then the finished product here on the right, maintaining the vector quality, that's important. And then we moved into raster. This was our initial. We used the Linework tool and a whole bunch of other options here just to kind of enhance the overall look, transparency and background and some other shadows. And we arrived at this. And there's our side-by-side comparison of the before and the after of the raster approach. And then the last image here we're going to look at is just a display of sort of the side-by-sides of each of those approaches. On the left, of course, we've been true to the lines, and on the right, we've tried to incorporate some of Revit's really fascinating shadow options, and you can see the result. Now, before we wrap this up, it's important to be aware of the difference between these two final products. It's obvious that the one on the right looks a little bit more punchy. It's kind of getting into the realm of a presentation graphic, so probably the image that's more appealing and more likely to sort of attract the attention of your viewers. But it's important to note something really different about the two based on the fact that one was vector and one was raster. So if we zoom in again, you'll see there's the nice preserved sharp line quality, while over here, eventually as we zoom in, we'll see sort of a breakdown, and we'll see the sort of busted illusion here that we've got a bunch of pixels making up this composition. What's important to note about these two is that there's going to be a really significant difference in the size of the files. So over on the left, we're going to have a much smaller file size because we've preserved that vector quality. And over on the right, even though it's maybe a little bit more sort of graphically significant and punchy, we've actually generated a much larger file. On a one-off, that's probably not going to matter, but if you can imagine a full set of sheets, that's going to be a factor maybe in what decision we make and which one of those graphic strategies that we pursue. So keep that in mind. There might be a lot of times where you want to kind of keep it simple like on the left and go with the smaller file size. So that's how we deal with the elevation dilemma, lines or shadows. Hopefully that was informative and enjoyable. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing, and there's more good videos to come.